Hi, everybody. Welcome to our mini-scoop this week. And mini-scoop is supposed to be sort of fun and light and easy. And I really went for it today because we are going to cover everything from hugs to references to fascism. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but I promise it's going to make sense in just a moment. To warm us up and get us ready for this report, I have to share this story that just made me laugh out loud this week. Let me just show it to you. It's from the Associated Press. The title, Hug It Out, but Make It Quick. New Zealand airport sets time limit on goodbyes. Okay, so this is an airport in Dunedin in New Zealand. And apparently there was some sort of issue, or so it seems, about the length of time drop-offs were taking. So the CEO of the airport thought it would be a good idea to max your hug time. What they're calling it is a cuddle cap. That's the amount of time that you can actually cuddle until you go into the airport. So your max time to do that is 3 minutes. If you want more time, you actually have to go to the airport parking lot or drop-off area where you get 15 minutes. So it's not, it's a little bit more, but not that much. But 3 minutes is your max hug time. That's the warning signs outside the terminal. And apparently it caused a little bit of controversy on social media. This is according to Dan DeBono. He's the CEO of the airport. He said, "We were accused of breaching basic human rights. How dare we limit how long someone can have a hug for?" And he goes on, 3 minutes was plenty of time to pull up, say farewell to your loved ones, and move on, he said. The time limit is really a nicer way of saying, get on with it. Now, he tries to also quote science, which says a 20-second hug is what you really need for that bonding, for that serotonin. So he's like, if you get 20 seconds, 3 minutes, you're getting a lot more than that. So his argument is it should be enough. My question for you, is it enough? Do we need cuddle caps? Should those exist in other places beyond just the airport? A street corner, perhaps? Should it be 3 minutes and that's it? I'll leave that up to you. But if you see any signs for cuddle caps at an airport near you, you know it started in New Zealand, where they are limiting hug time. All right, here's a few other stories that I thought were really underreported this week, and I wanted to share them with you. We're going to go through them 1, 2, 3. So the first one is a headline from the Wall Street Journal. Home sales on track for worst year since 1995. That's a really scary headline. This week, we actually received some new data, though, on existing home sales. That's the largest portion of the market in general. And when you say existing homes, is exactly how it sounds. An existing home is a home that's already built. So you're not building a brand new home. Someone's already lived in it, and now they're selling it. Sales are down in September. That's the new data. So we just got it just this week, but it's the full picture for the year that's raising a lot of concerns because it's one of the slowest years for sales in decades. And this matters because think of what goes into buying a home and moving. It's not just the real estate purchase and those costs. It's also all the extras, the plumbers, because you found a leaky faucet. There's a new shower. You need a new bath mat. You need some new bedding, maybe a new candle from Home Goods. I don't know. I could be projecting, but that goes into kind of making your space what you want it to be. So the impact of slower home sales is far-reaching. And that's why this really matters. It's also important to note that after the election, maybe with lower mortgage rates in the future, we see pent-up demand in the spring because everybody likes to move when they get, getting into the summer before the school year. So if we saw an increase in sales in the future, we'd pay attention for the same reason, because of the far-reaching impact of the housing market. So I just want you to know the data is not good now. The question is, what is it going to look like in the future? And in general, when we get negative news on the housing market, we wonder, what is it mean for the broader economy? So that's a story you didn't really see this week, and I wanted to make sure it was on your radar. Another underreported story this week has to do with the U.S. border, and this is a big one. Border encounters overall have decreased. We just got brand new data this week about encounters at the border. So this is anyone who's encountered by Border Patrol who doesn't have legal permission to be in the United States. And that could look like a lot of different people. That can include a 16-year-old traveling alone, a gang of guys who are clearly up to no good. Everyone's sort of put in that bucket of this number. So overall, the big headline is that we had a notable decline last month. And over the last several months, we've seen quite significant lower numbers at our borders. Now, we don't want to go too far with this. The trend is that it's decreasing, but we've seen a historic level of encounters in general this year. Regardless of this change, Those numbers for the entire year are really big. It's the trend, though, that I want to flag for you because the border is such a big issue. The trend is that we're seeing lower encounters. Customs and Border Protection say this is because of an executive action taken by President Biden back in June. But that makes these numbers even more important because it begs the question, what's going to happen to that executive action? Will the next president continue this executive action? Did the executive action do something really good that Congress might want to consider for new legislation? Will an executive action like this withstand legal challenge? Because we know there's some legal challenges to this executive action that basically said, if you came across the border without legal status and you said you wanted asylum, but you weren't doing it in a legal way, you crossed the border illegally, then that would prevent you from pursuing asylum. And so that's what the executive action's about. So we're going to continue to watch that story at the border. Again, it's a really big one, and it's one that we'll continue to see. Does this trend actually last? The final headline I want to flag for you has to do with what's happening overseas. The Secretary of Defense was in Ukraine this week, and one of the reasons he was in Ukraine is to announce $400 million more in military aid. Now, that's important, but just last week, there was also another announcement of an additional $425 million in military aid. So we have more than $800 million in military aid to Ukraine in the last 2 weeks. We also have an addition of a $50 billion loan that we've helped organize with other countries. So the significant amount of money and aid felt like something that we needed to flag. It's a flurry of activity. And it begs the question, why now? Is it out of concern that Russia is training North Korean troops that we heard the White House confirm? Is it because Ukraine can win with this aid? Is there a change to something that's happening on the ground there that we should be aware of? What does winning really look like in Ukraine? That's another story we should be asking. So with all the other news we're covering, I thought it was important for you to know this. This is not direct dollars. It's not direct money. It can be things like armored vehicles, for example, but it's still our resources that are being given out. And whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that can be debated, but I just wanted you to know that it's happening. These stories are all based on new information, some new data that we didn't have last week that is brand new this week that I wanted to share with you. And when I think of what stories we can share on Smarter News, I ask that question, is it new? What are the facts? Why does it matter? And what are people saying about it? This is what determines what we prioritize. But one of the news stories that gained a lot of attention this week, really a lot of national attention, was sort of in this gray area. But because the story created so much press and got so much attention, I wanted to share with you how it came about. Because if you open up your social media, you open up your laptop, and you see a reference to Adolf Hitler, for example, or fascism, or threats to democracy, I want you to know where that came from, at least this time. So let me just set the stage. At the beginning of the week, we had two stories, one that was published in the New York Times and one that was published in the Atlantic. These are separate publications. They're owned by different companies. One's a newspaper, the other is a magazine. They had different reporters. Both stories came out within the same day, and they had a very similar theme about former President Trump. The New York Times interviewed John Kelly, a former cabinet official in the Trump administration. He was a former chief of staff, and he's been critical of the former president before, but he hadn't been interviewed recently. And he let the New York Times record some audio, and the New York Times really asked him some pointed questions about the former president. The Atlantic piece sourced a variety of different people, some unnamed, but also including John Kelly. And there were some different critiques and some similar critiques and some similar topics covered. But both pointed to conversations that former President Trump allegedly had in which he talked about military loyalty or praised Adolf Hitler, and just generally painted the former president in a really negative light. I'm putting both pieces in the show notes so that you can read them yourself. The reason why these stories matter is because these are major publications coming out with pretty major accusations about a presidential candidate about 2 weeks before the elections. The stories came out in tandem, and because of that, the momentum was strong. So other news organizations like the Wall Street Journal or CNN or Fox News, they covered these reports. The general critique of the former president wasn't necessarily new. I believe that over the years, whether or not you like former President Trump or you hate former President Trump, you have likely heard before that someone has referred to him as a fascist. So that's not necessarily new. but the packaging was, and some of the details were. It's the timing and the sourcing of both of these stories that I found interesting and worth questioning. After the stories were published, the vice president, obviously who's a presidential candidate, delivered a 3-minute written statement outside the vice presidential residence in response, saying it was, quote, deeply troubling and incredibly dangerous for the president to make these reported comments. President Trump came out. He denied making these comments. So did his team. The campaign in general denies all of this. And he himself called Vice President Harris a threat to democracy less than 24 hours later after she made that statement. So there's a lot of back and forth between the campaigns. So why am I telling you all of this? Let me be totally clear. I don't think these stories should not have been published. I think you deserve to know everything about who you are voting for president, every detail. Even if one candidate denies it, it's up for you to decide who you're actually going to believe. But I have questions about the timing of these pieces just before the elections, and especially because they are so on step, they're on beat with the vice president's campaign messaging. And even if that's just simply coincidental, because that can happen, it can create a negative public perception of the media's relationship with the campaigns. And what I truly worry about most in America is that we have a free and independent press that has been constitutionally provided for us by our founders. This is why I created Smarter News. It's you I worry most about, not any of these reports or even these candidates. I want you to have a free, independent press. I want you to trust the news again. So I wanted you to know all these questions I have surrounding this story that consumes so much of the national airwaves this week, seemingly without any questions at all. So just taking a step back, here's some of the things that are just on my mind that when I see stories like this, I just wonder about. Here's the first thing. Why now? John Kelly says he felt compelled to speak on the record now because of comments made by former President Trump just recently. I would ask John Kelly, was he asked to comment now? Was he recruited to conduct the interview? Did he get paid? Does he maybe want a job in the next administration? Was he promised anything? He may have absolutely felt compelled to speak out, and nothing indicates otherwise. But I'd ask that question. I would have a responsibility to, especially at this point on your behalf, simply because of the timing. Both pieces took a lot of time to report, to write, a lot of copy editing, fact checking, probably a review by legal within these news organizations. So the fact that they were released on the same day-ish just sort of raises my antenna. I don't know what to make of it, but I have to ask that question. I also want to know more about the editorial choices behind running these stories and what's next. In reporting this news, the New York Times and the Atlantic have become the news themselves in many ways. You know, the journalists are being interviewed, for example. So to me, there's always something to move cautiously about, because when the media becomes the news, we can lose prioritizing the audience. Here's an example of an editorial choice made last election cycle where it feels like there's a good argument that the audience got lost in a media politics battle where the people were sort of left out. So if you go back to October 2020, there was a story about Hunter Biden and his laptop. It was covered by the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. It was dismissed by other networks as a hit piece. For many reasons, in part because all those news organizations are owned by a more conservative-leaning media business. And to them, that felt bias. That could even arguably be a fair criticism, but what happened next is truly something I've never actually seen before. The story itself was then censored and removed or blocked on Twitter and on Facebook. It was also labeled misinformation and blamed on the Russians. I mean, so many different things happened around this story as the media sort of faced off against each other. Fast forward, beyond that point, parts of that story have been proven factual and actually used in court as evidence. So I mention this because this story is not the same as the one that we're talking about now, but it's an example of how the media makes editorial choices. And when the media choices become the news over what the audience needs to know, it's usually a bad formula where we've lost priority. Okay, here's something else I'm thinking about. If references to Adolf Hitler and fascism are the reports leading this week, about 10 days from the election as we record this, then where are we at the end of next week? What stories come next? If these are the major concerns of those who worked with former President Trump, or there are other egregious claims against, for example, Vice President Harris, I want you to know sooner rather than later. And so is there more coming? Is this it? Is there a race to the bottom from here? As we get closer to Election Day, stories are going to appear more and more political. And they could be unrightly dismissed for that reason when they're actually something that you should consider. So here's my final thought. In these final days before the election, I don't want these questions about motives and the media to be the story. The focus needs to be on the people and the issues that matter most to you and getting you the information you need to help you feel confident in your vote. Whatever that is the reason why we have a free press. That's why it was important to our founders that we did. So maybe this story is that for you. Maybe it's providing some new information that you hadn't considered. Maybe it's not. But let me know your thoughts about media, the motivations, and the story choices that you see that are leading the news cycle. I know that home sales can't always do that. It's not as splashy as conversations that happen behind closed doors. But I don't want us to lose some of the real foundational stories that could infect you on a real daily basis for some of these other stories that can even have the appearance of feeling like something else. So I wanted you to have that background in case you need it, and I'm curious your thoughts moving ahead. We're getting closer and closer to the election every single day. So thank you for your support of Smarter News, and I'll see you next week with The Scoop.